Hi there, and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. The Byline Times, it's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. My name is Adrian Goldberg, and this time a conversation with a lawyer called Christian Weaver. You might know him as the face of The Law in 60 Seconds on YouTube. He's got a new book out called Your Right to Protest, Understand It, Use It, a guide to making your voice heard without breaking the law. That's not always an easy task these days, given two major pieces of legislation enacted by the last Tory government, which Labour, under Keir Starmer, shows no signs of repealing. Christian was also the barrister in the case of Awaab Ishak, the 2-year-old boy who died as the result of a mould infestation at his family's council flat in Rochdale. This is a case which led to a change in the law. Christian, welcome to you. Before we talk about Awaab Ishak and we talk about your new book, I want to talk about you because you've come to the law as the result of injustice suffered by you and your family. Tell me about that.
Absolutely, Adrian. Thank you so much for having me. So one of my earliest childhood memories, and I'll touch on this in both of my books because it's been such an impactful thing for me, is seeing racist abuse. My grandparents, they were subjected to racist attacks weekly where people would put feces on their car and outside the pathway of their home. So, when they'd enter the car or touch the car, there'd be feces there. When they try and step out of the property, there'd be feces. I always caveat it with it's my childhood memory, but some things just stick out so strongly. They have had this impact. So yeah, my family tried to call the police, contact the police, nothing was done. And in the end, my grandfather decided to put a placard up outside of the house and say, this family will not be intimidated by racists. And in that moment, I learned so much about society, life, power dynamics, power structures. Because for me, if you can imagine a kid in primary school and what they're taught at school, if you ever have any issues, you talk to the police. I realized, okay, we've got an issue here. We've spoken to the police and nothing's being done. And then you start to question, well, why is nothing being done? Why is this issue that's tormenting my family not being seen as an issue worthy of a police response? My grandfather, like I said, put up this placard and the racist incidents actually stopped, not before there was a lot of publicity and media around what was happening. And it was quite a big thing in Nottingham at the time. But I then learnt the power of people power. My granddad was the leader of a very big church in Nottingham at the time. So there was a lot of support from the Black community, actually, on what was going on. And I learned from a young age, okay, people, when they stand up for themselves, can stop things happening. So if you imagine that childhood memory, and then when I got slightly older, so entering secondary school, this is a conversation that every Black son has had with their parents. It's the conversation about the police and stop and search and how to navigate a stop and search situation. So if you imagine the context that I'm going through, it's earliest childhood memory, or one of, is the fact that in our time of need, the police weren't there. And as I'm getting older, I'm taught, okay, how do you navigate yourself if the police stop and search you? And again, this is counter to now what my white friends and some of my very best friends are white guys. And I've seen their life, I've seen inside their homes. And they weren't conversations they were having. So even then when you extend into maybe you're 16, 17, 18, you're starting to go out a bit more independently at night times, you see the way in which you respond when you see police as opposed to how your friends might. And they might actually feel a sense of safety, where I might have a healthy skepticism or actually a sense of danger. And again, context to this is that I was born in 1994. The year prior to my birth was the murder of Stephen Lawrence. So if you imagine being a mother, and as I get that bit older now, I can almost start to appreciate these things from a parent perspective as opposed to a child perspective. But if you imagine you're raising a child that will one day grow up to look just like Stephen Lawrence, and you've watched how, Doreen did an incredible campaign, but you've watched how, absent her doing anything, her son was murdered and nothing was really going to be done as a result of what we now know to be institutional racism. You can see how that would almost force you to have conversations with your child that no child should have to be having with their parents at that sort of age. So I say that to explain my context. And as I'm sure we'll get on to, work I've done since has had that people power and protest, in a large part perhaps born out of those earliest experiences, Adrian.
So as a young Black man in Nottingham, it seems to me you learnt two lessons. One was the lack of willingness of the police to intervene on your behalf against racist harassment. Completely wrong. No excuse for that. But you also learned, as you said, the value of people power then. Once your grandfather places a placard saying that this family will not be intimidated, it draws press and media attention. And you understand the value then of kicking up a fuss, of standing up for yourself, but letting people know that you're standing up for yourself.
I think so. And importantly, the fact that you can't necessarily wait for anybody else to do it for you. So you start it, and then often actually, because I think inherently, I'd like to think on a large part, people are good people. They will support, but often it's you that has to start first. Now, it goes on to other things in society where what I've learned through my career is that there are some people in society that are genuinely powerless, genuinely powerless. I could never truly appreciate that there are people in this society that have no power until certain cases I've taken on. And I think those people, there's I think actually a duty on others to be that power for them, for then public support to come in. My grandfather, by virtue of his position as a church leader, did have that bit of power to start things off. And then, of course, after that, he had the support. But yes, that was a huge, huge lesson, hugely valuable lesson. And I don't think that will ever leave me.
I've spoken to Nazir Afzal previously on this podcast, Christian. Nazir is the former prosecutor for Northwest England, and he's spoken about racist attacks against him and his family in Birmingham in the 1960s and 1970s. And that was the prompt for him to take up the law. It's sad that a couple of decades later, the same impetus is still there, but at least by becoming involved in the law, by becoming a barrister, it gives you some tools with which to fight back and also to help other people in a similar situation.
Absolutely, yes. And the sad reality is there are cases that I've taken on. I'm thinking of one case in particular that I'll know we'll touch on, which is the tragic death of Awaab Ishak. But when Awaab's parents talk to the other children they have, they will be mentioning racism. And you actually realize that despite how we as a society might like to hold ourselves up to the international community, there are these issues that have existed from when my parents used to say they would see signs saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, that still persist all this way through. It's deeply troubling and it's deeply problematic. And I think the most worrying thing is that it's not actually just the racism, it's the fact that the racism is having an effect. It's the racism that is meaning that you're not getting a police response. It's the racism that might mean that you're taught these things about stops and search. It's the racism that Awaab's family might feel had a role in why they weren't listened to. That might be a view they hold, perhaps for good reason, but with negative effect that is so, so deeply damaging and problematic.
Well, let's talk about the Awaab Ishak case then, because you've mentioned powerlessness. Here are a migrant family living in Rochdale in a council flat. So, a family who are not particularly well connected with local media, who may lack the knowledge of how UK society works, unable to trigger the kind of responses that your grandfather was able to trigger as a church leader in Nottingham. But they were not helpless people, were they? I mean, Awaab Ishak's parents complained to the local housing provider, which was an arm's length organisation set up by Rochdale Council. They were people who tried standing up for themselves and yet were tragically let down by the housing company.
Absolutely. Something I'm going to just add for context there as well is the fact that, just in case it's of relevance to our viewers or helps their understanding, Awaab's dad right now is training to be an electrician. Awaab's mum right now is training to be a nurse. So things I've seen in certain parts of the media that they were scroungers or that they were trying to just claim off the system, it couldn't be further from the truth. Awaab, as you say, he died when he was 2, and all throughout his life, the family had been making complaints to Rochdale Borough Housing about the state of the property that they were living in. And that wasn't it. An NHS health visitor went round to the property at a certain point, and she wrote to Rochdale Borough Housing about the issues she was seeing. At one point, somebody from Rochdale Borough Housing, somewhat unrelated, but went to the property. They saw for themselves the mould in the property. Nothing was done. At this point, the mould in the property meant that the legal definition of the house would be unfit for human habitation. And then again, we talk about powerlessness. The family actually were able to instruct lawyers. And if you imagine, even for the ordinary person, that actually instructing lawyers is not an easy task. But they, despite being refugees from Sudan, found a way to do it because they were so concerned. And at that point, Rochdale Borough Housing actually said, now because lawyers are instructed, we aren't doing the works at all, because they had a policy in place that meant that if lawyers were involved, then works would pause. That was absolute powerlessness. And then Awaab tragically died. And the 2 points came out at the inquest that absent there being professional intervention, the mold was of such a level that there was nothing the family could actually do. So we saw evidence of the stain marks from where they tried to bleach it off, get it off. But absent professional intervention, there was nothing they could do. So absent RBH taking action, nothing was going to change. And the second point is the fact that Awaab tragically died, but that was a considerable time after their first complaint, and nothing had been done. So if Awaab was able to reach age 3, age 4, age 5, would anything have actually ever changed? There's no evidence that it would.
And the council were first alerted to the mold problem by the family in 2017. It took until 2020 for Awaab to tragically pass away as a result of the spores from the mold affecting his lungs. And the institutional racism that you've discussed elsewhere is a feature here as well. So that in Awaab's case, for example, one of the factors given for the creation of the mold was supposedly the ritual bathing that the family took part in. But this was just an assumption on behalf of the Housing Association, RHB. The family did not engage in ritual bathing.
Absolutely. The question was never even asked. I think that was actually the part I found most disgusting. The question was never actually asked. To be able to mount this assumption based on no evidence in such a catastrophic circumstance is bewildering to me. For the record, I asked the question of the family and they were bemused. They said, we had a shower. Why on earth would there be any other way we would bathe ourselves if there was a working shower there? So yes, not only was the ritual bathing and cooking practices brought into the mix, but in addition, there was a lot of investigations done, various housing associations across the country, one done in relation to RBH2 by the Housing Ombudsman. And that found that there was evidence that internally conversations would take place where staff would say to each other, well, the person's lucky to have a house anyway, given they're a refugee from a different country, as if to say less of a pressing need to fix the issue. And I think that's just so sad, so sad.
It is an horrendous case, and nothing really can be consolation for the loss of a child in any circumstance, but certainly in these circumstances, it is a terrible, terrible thing for a parent to have to experience, and for the child to experience, and for a society to have to contemplate. But there was at least Awaab's law, which came out of this. Now, explain how that works and tell me about the drawback to that, because there is one key drawback to Awaab's law.
So following the inquest, Webb's parents, they had so much dignity throughout the case. And the only thing they said is that we would never want any family to go through this situation again. So spearheaded by the Manchester Evening News, which again, I always mention speaks to the power of people because they really help galvanize people. 180,000 people signed a petition calling for an Awaab's law. And fundamentally, what that would mean is that if you're a tenant living in social housing and you made a complaint recognizing a hazard in your property, there will be time limits, time frames by which your landlord must respond. And the Conservative Michael Gove actually took that a step further and said that, if an issue is an emergency hazard, then actually the proposal was 24 hours to fix that. Now, Awaab's law will be happening. The exact terms of it are something we still must campaign for. And because it came through by way of the Social Housing Regulation Bill Now Act, it pertains specifically to social housing. Now, those that listen to the show will know that there are significant issues in privately rented accommodation as well. And the new Labour government have committed to extending Awaab's law to the privately rented sector. But again, pressure must continue to be placed on that to happen because as we speak right now, Awaab's law cannot be used. And there are people that will come into serious harm the longer that is the situation.
Yeah, I mean, it seems astonishing that there is a recognition that such a law is needed, but because of the parliamentary route that it has taken, the power that is given to ordinary people only applies to those in social housing, not in private rented housing, but they may have exactly the same need with exactly the same urgency.
This is the thing. I personally feel that whenever situations arise whereby there is such a public outrage and it's recognized, oh, wow, that the law needs to change, all of the frameworks and bureaucracy that mean that, oh, actually, it can only apply to this part, but not this part, when actually we know that there is a big issue, measures need to be taken to ensure that's promptly done. Because if we actually look at Awaab's case, and it's something I always talk about, but there wasn't an automatic right for Awaab's family to have legal aid at the inquest. And what that meant was that were it not for the fact that Farley's solicitors were willing to take it on a pro bono, and I was willing to take it on pro bono, that meant that Faisal and Aisha, who were Awaab's parents from Sudan, refugees from Sudan, who at the time couldn't speak great English at all, would have been up against two entities, Rochdale Broward Housing and the Northwest Ambulance Service, heavily lawyered up, and they would be expected to put their case to a coroner or explain what had happened against two entities that some might say in a general setting in an inquest are concerned about reputation management. How can that be expected to be the case? But I say that to say that were it not for the fact that family had lawyers, or Awaab's law and these changes that are taking place would never be happening because there had been no admissions prior to that inquest of any wrongdoing from anybody. The only information we had was that maybe it was due to the ritual bathing practices of this family. How can a family that can't even speak English at the time, for good reason, they've only just arrived, be expected to defend themselves against that? It's disgusting.
And the fact that they got legal representation was because you and others were willing to work initially pro bono because you believed in the cause of justice.
Yes, and as I know you'll appreciate, but that should never be an expectation. Never be an expectation. But
No,
yes.
well, I've spoken on this podcast before about whether it's the victims of the Hillsborough tragedy, whether it's victims of the Birmingham pub bombings in 1974, even though the inquest was only held, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. In these cases where you get public bodies who, as you say, are lawyered up against organisations representing ordinary people, coalitions of ordinary people who just don't have access to the same legal resources. I mean, it's just a fundamental inequality in the law. And I don't know what you think, but there have been calls for what's been called a Hillsborough law to try and make sure that communities in those situations are given the same rights of legal representation as public bodies.
As somebody that actually sees it up front, it's so important. Hillsborough law, which actually a barrister at my chambers, Pete Weatherby KC, has been a key part of, but that also includes this duty of candor, whereby actually transparency with these organizations, it shouldn't be the case that underpaid lawyers, and I say that because some are genuinely working pro bono, are having to read through thousands of pages of documents and disclosure for a revelation to come out. Actually, if the organization know there's an issue, they should come transparently to the court hearing with that information there. So absolutely. And I think just a final point I'll make on legal aid is the fact that laws can exist, but if a person can't afford to take their case to court, there's actually no point in the law existing. So even with the Awaab's law, if it's the case that, so to take it in stages, Awaab's law will ensure that if your landlord doesn't listen to you, you're ignored, you're able to go to court. Now, if the government don't also ensure that there's proper legal aid in place for when a person might need to go to court, then there's no point in the law existing because the tenant can't do anything about it anyway. So a point I always say is, again, this country, we can make out that when it comes to the law and human rights, we are brilliant compared to other international countries. But the reality is, if the ordinary person can't afford to take their case to court, not only is it only an illusion these laws existing, but furthermore, there's no actual incentive for those with power to actually adhere to the law themselves. Because if the person is a victim to the law not being followed, can't take the case to court anyway, then what is the consequence? So there's a real deep structural problem here.
Yeah, indeed, and important to make that point loud and long, and we're more than happy to amplify it here on the Byline podcast, as well as the case of Awaab Ishak. I know there's another very heartrending case that you've been involved with as well, Exodus Awaab, and there's a campaign around the death of Exodus as well. Just talk me through that.
Absolutely. So Exodus was a young boy that died from tragically falling out of a tower block window in Leeds. And his family is certain, and I have to word it like that because there aren't formal records of this. I would add that's not something unusual we see in social housing, poor record keeping by the landlord. However, to be clear, the family assert they made numerous complaints to the landlord, detailing that they were concerned about the window. And it wasn't that the window was actually faulty as such, but it was the fact that the window lacked permanent and fixed restrictors, which meant that it had the potential to open up entirely. So a person, a child, an adult actually, could literally topple out of the window.
And this is in a tower.
This is in a tower block, yes. And that's exactly what happened to Exodus. And what's interesting is the reason the family assert that they were regularly complaining was because Exodus's slightly older brother had autism, and it meant that he had quite an attraction to the mechanism on the window. And because of that, the family were concerned that even if the mechanism technically works, if it's disengaged, thus enabling the window to open entirely out, anybody could fall through. And yes, that's tragically what happened to Exodus. So The campaign that around 50,000 people have signed now, being led by my instructing solicitor, Gareth Naylor, is saying that tenants in high-rise property should have the automatic right to fixed window restrictors. Now, some might not want it, but for those that do, perhaps because they have legitimate concerns, they have children living in very high-rise buildings, they should be entitled to that. What's significant about Exodus's case is the fact that just 12 years prior, Liam Shackleton was another boy that had fallen out of a property also owned by Leeds City Council. So they were on notice of this issue.
So if you're a single person, if you're a couple, if you have got children there and they're older kids who understand the risks, fine, you can have unrestricted windows. But if you know you've got children and young children with the best will in the world, no matter how much of an eye you try and keep on them, will find corners where you can't find them. If you've got those kind of kids, and I think most parents will recognize that scenario, you should just have the right to say the windows can be restricted. And if you ask the landlord to do that, they should do that. And that's the call. That should be the law.
Absolutely. Simple as that. It's entirely preventable.
Well, talk about your book, your right to protest, understand it, use it. I can tell from talking to you clearly that the right to protest is at your heart, really, at the core of your being as a human being and as a barrister as well. But the last Conservative government, I mentioned this in the introduction, brought in two pieces of legislation, two significant pieces of legislation, which restricted the right to protest. And there's no appetite, so far as I can tell, from Keir Starmer's Labour Party to repeal those acts. So just talk me through those and how they affected the right to protest.
The first thing I'll state on that is actually the energy, the effect that it gives off when such legislation even exists. So before even going into the nuances of what it's about, just the fact that you can peacefully protest and the law can come down so harshly on you, or it can be so significantly curtailed, one might say deters a person's willingness to protest.
Chilling effect, as people say, yeah?
The chilling effect, absolutely. And when one considers that Article 10 is your, freedom of expression, Article 11 is freedom of assembly.
Of the Human Rights Act, yeah?
Absolutely, yes. These are rights that we have. One would like to think that the law would be set out to support you in engaging in your human rights, not this chilling effect that might dissuade you from engaging in rights that have been hard fought for and are yours to use. So the two key pieces of legislation are the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act and the new Public Order Act. And perhaps the main point that your viewers might be interested in is in the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act. This all centers around something called serious disruption, but perhaps the key point is that things such as noise, conditions can be put on noise levels of protests. And if protest is deemed to be too noisy, then that can actually now make someone potentially fall foul of the law. And why that's concerning is that when we consider the nature of protest is often to make public aware of a certain issue, you can see how near automatically that will make a person potentially think twice. And yes, protest that's noisy might be disruptive, but it's also non-violent. And one might say that when such efforts are being made to curtail non-violent protest, that actually can lead to unintended consequences that are actually far worse. And I think that's worth government appreciating as well, that this non-violent protest, it's there for a good reason. It allows people to vent their frustrations. Hopefully it allows government to properly listen to them, but it actually can prevent things much more disruptive happening in society. And then of course we have the Public Order Act as well. And that introduced new offences which place restrictions on specific protest tactics, locking on being an example. And it also beefed up stop and search powers in relation to protest as well. So there are always balancing acts, of course. Protest isn't an absolute right. Protest can be restricted, and the Articles 10 and 11 recognise that as well. But I think what we're seeing here is, as you say, this chilling effect and the real risk that actually very legitimate, peaceful protest will be curtailed.
And I suppose if people feel that their right to legitimate peaceful protest is being curtailed, either it may deter them altogether. And I know you talk about this in the book about how people might protest in other ways, but it may also persuade some people to feel, well, there's no point in peaceful protest, and they might adopt more violent methods, which is in nobody's interests.
Absolutely, absolutely. And fundamentally, we live in a democracy. We don't have elections every single day in this country. There can be a significant number of years where a government's in power. They might have been voted in by you or me via the ballot box. You can't do anything about it. You can't make your views known. Protest is a way that you can do that. And as you identify, my book talks about lots of different types of protests, not just those that pertain to taking to the streets, because of course, those that are maybe physically less able, that might be a challenge.
So if people are chilled out of street protests, what are the sort of areas of protest that you talk about that hopefully won't get them into any trouble?
It's probably helpful that you very kindly allow me to talk through how I got to this point, because the book could also be called How to Use Your Voice, how to add power behind your voice, because I've recognized that some people, they can say whatever they want, but the power isn't there behind their voice. And that means they're never listened to. So it allows you to read the book and identify, what are the areas I would want to raise my concerns and how can I use the law to back that? So online activism, it talks about how you can use the internet to make your voice heard. It talks about how you can utilize freedom of information requests. It talks about how you can utilize subject access requests. It talks about literally whether you're in the comfort of your home. It talks about petitions. Whatever would suit your style of protest is something that you can do. And fundamentally, something I've been really keen to do in the book is avoid labeling people as protesters, because there might be people that don't actually, that label doesn't sit right with them. They don't feel like they're protesters or activists, but what they do feel they are concerned mums about something going on in society that's affecting their sons or daughters. And actually, there are ways that, don't mean you have to identify as an activist or protester, but there are ways you can make your voice heard, it have impact, and this book seeks to help people do that. As a prime example, it details things such as, for example, writing a letter to your MP, but the ways in which I've learned through my practice that you might want to script that letter and things to include so that it doesn't just pile up on the hundreds of letters on that MP's constituency desk, but actually notice is taken and hopefully changes made as a result.
Just to finish, Christian, I think it's just interesting, isn't it, to balance. On the one hand, I think we ought to be duly appreciative of the fact that we do live in a democratic society where people can protest, they can make their voices heard. That is the uplifting part of your message. The slightly downbeat part of it, I suppose, is that the right to protest has been curtailed in recent years. The right to peaceful protest has been curtailed. And the fact that issues like racism appear to be endemic, institutional, and multi-generational. I find that profoundly depressing. So, we have to weigh these things one against the other, maybe, but it's, there are things you can do, there are battles that you can fight and that you can win, as Awaab's law proves. But equally, there's such a long way to go, so many battles to be fought to create a better society.
Absolutely. And I think one message I would have to try and add an element of positivity is the fact that the way the political system works is that MPs get in by way of votes. So actually, if people do mobilize, if people do talk about not just street protests, but other ways of protest, and actually people start to represent voting blocks in some ways, actually, even politicians will therefore think we can't actually ignore this group that are complaining about X, Y, or Z. And hopefully, by way of those things, it can bring about pressure and positive changes can be made.
Christian, thank you for your time. Christian Weaver is a barrister at Garden Court North Chambers, and his book is called Your Right to Protest. Understand it, use it. I'm Adrian Goldberg, and before we go, just to remind you that the Byline podcast is part of bylineaudio.com, which is a fantastic array of podcasts that you can listen to now, including Utter Bollocks with Otto English and John Mitchinson, which takes well-known myths and punctures them with wit and erudition. And there's the brilliant Adventures in Americana with Bonnie Greer and Hardeep Matharo. So head over to bylineaudio.com. There's a premium option available as well, small fee payable, but that does get you access to audio that you can't hear anywhere else, and an ad-free version of this podcast, which was produced in Birmingham by me and Harvey White for Byline Audio. We'll see you again very soon, but for now, thanks for listening. Cheers and goodbye.